Alongside the personal grief that the royal family continues to navigate, there is now a shared sense of shock rippling through the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. When Queen Camilla quietly moved Queen Elizabeth's priceless jewelry into her own family members' private chambers, she acted under the assumption of absolute privacy. She had no idea that King Charles III, a man currently balancing the weight of a crown with the frailty of his own health, would find out. And what he did next, the cold, calculated, and public stripping of his consort's status, shook the entire institution to its core. It was a day when the promise of a life well lived, a legacy, kept by the late Queen Elizabeth II, was suddenly stained by modern greed and an unthinkable breach of trust. The state funeral of Elizabeth II, watched by billions, had supposedly closed a chapter of history, burying the old world with the woman who defined it. The mourning bands had been removed, the black crape folded away, and the business of the monarchy had resumed with a forced mechanical precision. But behind the velvet curtains, something had gone terribly wrong. As royal tradition dictates, the personal effects of a deceased monarch, their private journals, intimate letters, and the most sacred of their heirlooms are to be secured under a legal seal for nearly a century. This archival period, enforced by the Royal Collection Trust, ensures that a monarch's legacy remains sovereign property, untouched by family squabbles or public curiosity until 100 years have passed. The full treasury of Elizabeth II was never meant to be touched by living hands in our lifetime. Yet on that quiet Wednesday morning, Donald Walton, the royal treasurer, appeared at the palace not with a scheduled report, but with a confession that turned the king's blood cold. A significant portion of Her late Majesty's private possessions was missing. Imagine the sheer weight of that silence in the king's study as the list of stolen items was read aloud. It was a catalogue of history itself. Among the missing was the sapphire Jubilee brooch, a piece the Queen wore to mark her 65th year on the throne. The double-strand pearl necklace she had famously worn at the funeral of Princess Diana. And perhaps most dangerously, a set of handwritten journals penned during the isolation of the COVID-19 lockdowns. These weren't just notebooks. They were the Queen's final unvarnished thoughts to her heirs, containing secrets of state and family that were never meant for unvetted eyes. By the time this report reached the desks of Prince William and Princess Anne, the typical palace calm had evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. This was not a mere lapse in security. It was a heist from within the very heart of the firm. William and Anne, acting with the strategic intensity of a wartime council, summoned Walton to a secure briefing chamber, the same room where generations of royals had planned for the survival of the monarchy. Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense iron will and her legendary devotion to her mother's memory, didn't waste a second on pleasantries. Her voice was sharp as a blade as she demanded to know how items under double lock and high-tech supervision could simply vanish. Walton, his fingers trembling as he adjusted his cufflinks, could only swear on his life that it was a deliberate, sophisticated breach. He described a system that had been bypassed by someone who knew the codes, the shift rotations and the blind spots of the surveillance cameras. When the news reached King Charles in his private study, he didn't erupt in anger. Instead, he rose slowly, shedding the blanket from his knees, his face pale but his eyes burning with a newfound steel. For Charles, this wasn't about the monetary value of gold or gems. It was about the sanctity of his mother's soul and the legitimacy of his own reign. He warned Walton that any attempt to soften the blow or play politics would be viewed as an act of treason. That evening at 4 p.m., the royal war room saw a gathering of the inner circle, William and Edward and Camilla. The tension was thick enough to choke the air. Camilla, seated to the king's right, was the first to speak, her voice smooth and suggesting that perhaps the treasurer himself was the culprit. She played the part of the concerned consort, perfectly weaving a narrative of external threats and untrustworthy staff. But William and Anne were wary. They knew that in a house as fortified as this, a pin doesn't fall without someone in the family hearing it. They watched Camilla's every micro-expression, noting a flicker of something, was it anxiety or calculation, whenever the specific items were mentioned. Charles, realizing that the usual chains of command were compromised, turned to a man who existed in the shadows, Sir Clement Mallister. Mallister was a legendary figure in British intelligence, a man who had served the crown through decades of international crises and whispered scandals. He was given a mandate of total discretion, a black ops authority, to investigate everyone within the palace walls. As Mallister began his probe, the outside world caught scent of the blood in the water. Headlines across the globe screamed of a palace in crisis. The internet became a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. Was it an international art syndicate, an inside job, a political distraction? The pressure on the palace was immense, reaching a fever pitch that threatened to boil over into a public relations disaster. Prince William was sent out to give a brief stern statement to stabilize the crumbling narrative. But the public didn't want dignity, they wanted a name. They wanted to know who had dared to rob the dead queen. The breakthrough came not from a veteran spy, but from a rookie analyst named Donna, who was part of Mallister's hand-picked team. In the windowless concrete basement that served as their temporary investigation hub, she found a ghost in the machine. While everyone was looking for high-tech hacks, she looked at the human element. She found that a guard named Robert Halton had clocked into the vault area at 3:49 a.m. on April 27th, 2 hours before his shift was supposed to begin. There was no follow-up, no remark, and he had curiously been cleared in the first round of questioning by the regular police. When Halton was brought back in for an interrogation by Mallister, the atmosphere in the room was suffocating. Under the threat of being flagged as a national security risk and losing everything he had worked for, Halton's resolve shattered. He didn't just confess, he wept. He told Mallister that he had been contacted by a voice from upstairs. They knew his name, his shift, and most cruelly they knew about his wife's terminal cancer and the mounting medical debts that were crushing his family. They offered him a sum of money that felt like a miracle, telling him the removal of the items was a sanctioned royal instruction to prevent them from being misplaced during a reorganization. He thought he was helping the crown while saving his wife. The most chilling moment of the entire investigation occurred when Donna traced the burner phone that had manipulated the desperate guard. The GPS ping didn't lead to a foreign operative's desk. It originated from within the walls of Buckingham Palace itself. Specifically, the signal had been centered in the East Wing, the very heart of the private royal apartments. This was a sophisticated orchestration from a position of immense power, someone who knew exactly which heartstrings to pull to bypass the most expensive security system on Earth. Mallister took this evidence straight to the king. The realization that the call came from inside the house forced Charles to authorize a desperate quiet measure, a discreet search of every royal residence, conducted not by police in boots, but by the personal maids and valets, who were the only ones capable of moving through the private chambers like shadows. Charles spoke to these servants not as their sovereign, but as a grieving son appealing to their sense of loyalty to the woman they had served for decades. For 48 hours, the palace was a hive of silent, invisible activity. Every senior royal was subjected to the same scrutiny, their private drawers and safes searched while they were distracted by official duties. Then on a Sunday evening, the silence was broken. Eleanor Hartridge, a maid assigned to Queen Camilla's private wing, approached Sir Clement with a jewelry box shaped like a rabbit. It was a child's trinket belonging to Camilla's granddaughter, Eliza. Hidden beneath a false bottom in that childhood box wrapped in silk was the sapphire Jubilee brooch. It was the smoking gun. The trail was undeniable. The call to the guard had been traced to that specific wing. The money had been transferred from an offshore account linked to Camilla's former associates, and the property was found in the possession of her bloodline. When Camilla was summoned to the king's private chamber, she didn't come as a woman defeated. She arrived in her dark green coat and pearls projecting an image of regal defiance that masked the trembling of her hands. The confrontation that followed was one for the history books. In the room with the brooch sitting on a velvet tray between them, King Charles looked at his wife and saw a stranger. He asked her one question. Why? Camilla didn't flinch. She didn't deny taking it. Instead, she offered a justification that chilled the king to his core. She claimed the late queen had promised her the pieces in private, a verbal agreement that she felt entitled to fulfill herself. She spoke of the years she had spent in the shadows, the other woman who had endured decades of public scorn to stand by Charles's side. She pointed to the jewelry worn by Catherine and Meghan, pieces that had belonged to Diana, and asked with a sharp, bitter edge why she and her children should be left with nothing but scraps. It was a moment of raw, naked ambition and deep-seated resentment that stripped away the carefully curated image of the supportive, low-maintenance consort. Camilla felt she was protecting her own legacy, ensuring that her family had a stake in the royal treasury. But Charles, a man who has spent his entire life waiting to serve a crown that represents duty above self, knew that the institution is greater than any individual's desires. He saw in Camilla's eyes not remorse, but a sense of entitlement that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy's trust with the people. If the queen consort could steal from the crown what was left of the moral authority of the House of Windsor, in a move that was as painful as it was necessary, Charles summoned his senior council and his heirs. He didn't ask for their opinion. He delivered a ruling. He stripped Camilla of her ceremonial duties, her titles in all but name, and signed a decree that barred her and her family from any future claim to royal property or state-funded benefits. He declared that the monarchy is built on service, and if that trust is broken by those closest to the throne, the crown loses its right to exist. The fallout was immediate and devastating. The television screens of the United Kingdom lit up that night with a headline that seemed like something out of a Shakespearean tragedy: Queen Camilla stripped of rights. The social media sphere erupted into a frenzy of debate, but for most the message was clear. The king had chosen his mother's legacy and his duty to the nation over his own personal heart. Charles's televised address to the nation was the performance of a man who had been pushed to his breaking point. He appeared exhausted, his voice gravelly, but resolute. He didn't celebrate the discovery, he mourned the necessity of the punishment. He spoke of accountability and the painful truth that in the House of Windsor, the crown must always come first. He thanked the staff who had remained loyal and promised that the treasures of the late queen would remain under the protection of the state as she had intended. Behind the scenes, the relationship between Charles and Camilla was effectively over a partnership built on decades of shared struggle, collapsing under the weight of one catastrophic act of greed. This fallout has redefined the modern monarchy, proving that Charles III is not the weak king some had feared, but a man capable of ruthless justice when the integrity of the crown is at stake. It serves as a stark reminder that even in an age of celebrity and media spin, there are lines that cannot be crossed. The tragedy of Camilla's fall is not just about a missing brooch or a pearl necklace. It is about the fragility of reputation and the high cost of entry into the pages of history. As the palace attempts to move forward, the empty chambers of the consort's wing stand as a silent testament to a betrayal that was caught just in time. The jewelry has been returned to its vault, the journals have been resealed for their 100-year sleep, and King Charles remains on his throne, a lonelier man perhaps. but a king who proved that his loyalty to the legacy of Elizabeth II is absolute. The public reaction has been a mix of horror and a strange kind of respect for the king's decisiveness. Many who had never fully accepted Camilla felt a sense of "I told you so," while others were saddened by the collapse of a love story they had finally begun to believe in. But the overarching sentiment is one of fascination. How could someone who had reached the very top of the social ladder risk everything for a few pieces of jewelry? The answer, perhaps, lies in the deep insecurities of those who enter the royal family. From the outside, the constant need to secure a future in a world where you are always one step away from being an outcast. Camilla's mistake was thinking she was bigger than the institution she married into. As we look at the empty space beside the king at official functions, we are reminded that the crown is a heavy burden, one that requires the sacrifice of personal loyalty for the sake of national stability. The journals of Queen Elizabeth II remain locked away, their secrets safe for another 90-odd years. But the secret of what happened in May 2025 will be whispered about for generations. It is a story of a guard who loved his wife, a spy who found a ghost, and a king who had to choose between his wife and his mother's ghost. In the end, the ghost won. The sapphire brooch sparkles once again in its display case, but the light it casts is cold, reflecting a family that is as fractured as it is famous. What do you think about this unprecedented move by King Charles? Was it the only way to save the monarchy, or did he go too far in punishing the woman he once claimed was the love of his life? The debate continues. But one thing is certain: the House of Windsor will never be the same again. Accountability, as Charles proved, is the only currency that matters when you wear the crown. And the price of betrayal is a shadow that never leaves you. The legacy of Elizabeth II remains intact, but the cost of that protection was the heart of the current king. As the sun sets over Windsor Castle, the halls are silent. But the echoes of that Wednesday morning remain a haunting reminder that in the world of the royals, no one is above the law of the crown. This is the reality of the modern monarchy, a place where duty is a cage and the truth is the only key that can set you free, even if it leaves you standing alone in the ruins of your own life. The story of the missing jewelry is now a part of the dark folklore of the palace. A warning to all who follow that the eyes of the crown are always watching, even behind the closed doors of the family's most private chambers. In the end, the jewels were just stones, but the betrayal was forever. This is the secret history of the House of Windsor, a tale of power pearls and the painful price of a king's justice. Keep watching, because in this palace, the next scandal is always just one heartbeat away.